Hello. Thank you all for joining us today, and especially to the previous authors for getting us started on this conversation of emphasizing the role of trust, especially as we try to emphasize trust as the warfighter's role in combat has evolving and continues to change. As she mentioned, I'm presenting in conjunction with Dr. Sandro Scielzo, but we also want to acknowledge our co-authors, Spencer Cohn with Perceptronic Solutions, as well as Alvin Abraham and Rachel Wong with CAE USA. With that, I will turn it over to Sandro to discuss the criticality of this topic.
Thank you, Beth. So the criticality really begins with human-machine teaming representing the next frontier in human factors, which ties in with the need to sustain a global force in a digital world. So if you focus on the top banner, you can see a timeline showing the evolution of human-machine interactions across time with a few examples, starting with underwater robotic teleoperations, events in the 60s, moving to the 80s with the application of AI to synthetic teammates, looking at autopilot as a use case, moving to this decade with the application of AI to synthetic teaming. And finally, to a future that's going to be really complex with humans collaborating with one or more machines and even swarms. So this leads to a paradigm shift that you heard in a previous talk, typically known as from tools to teammates. This paradigm shift is driven by future warfare needs, where human and machines need to collaborate to reduce cognitive burden and promote overall coordination. So a key construct here is that to promote accurate HMT interactions between the humans and the synthetic teammates, you have trust that sits, as was discussed in the previous talk, that is really a critical construct. But not just promoting trust, but the right level of trust. So with the right level of trust, you can maximize lethality and lower endangerment of humans. This need is further driven by the DoD communities of interest. For a number of years right now, they've outlined how research should tackle really hard problems. And what you see here is a mandate from the DoD communities of interest to understand how trust impacts shared human-agent interactions and collaborations. Thus, our goal, you see at the bottom, is to develop and validate a continuous trust measure to promote real-time optimization of human-machine collaboration. How do we measure trust in the context of human-machine teams? And how do we promote high-efficiency HMTs? Well, teams can be defined in many ways. And again, you've heard in a previous talk that what is at the core of a team is a dependency of team members with each other that then is applied to achieving a common goal. And trust, what is key to trust, really is a willingness to be vulnerable and to depend on each other and to meet each other's expectations. So you can see that without trust, you cannot really have high-performing HMTs. So HMTs must capitalize on the unique strength of humans and machines. We tend to see machines as consistent, fast, and accurate, as you see in the graphic, and we see ourselves as being more flexible, more creative, and great at detecting patterns, although frankly we're losing the edge there as well. But the point is that proper trust, which is often referred to as calibrated trust, you can see there in the middle of the figure, capitalizes on the optimal use of humans and machines alike. As you can see, calibrated trust ensures the greatest benefits by yielding optimal situation awareness for the team and low workload for the operator. Whereas poorly calibrated trust leads to overtrust or distrust. The box on the right visualizes that relationship, showing that correctly distrusting the system is as important as correctly trusting it. Which then you see how measuring trust in real time is really imperative in order to promote trust calibration techniques to optimize that trust calibration, which you see at the bottom further underlines the need to measure trust in human-machine teams. There are three main ways you can measure trust. You have self-reported measures, which are subjective and typically ask a number of questions to operators that they answer either beginning or after a team exercise, thus providing a very limited snapshot of trust in time. On the flip side, there's a sheer abundance of these measures that each look at trust from a slightly different viewpoint. Second, you have behavioral measures. Behavioral measures are great because they are objective and in situ and collect in real-time information. For example, behaviors via a user interface. But they tend to define trust as a risk-taking behavior. Finally, physiological measures can be used as biological indicators of trust. These measures are objective and continuous, which is great. They're desired traits, but they can be obtrusive and typically require lengthy post-hoc analysis. Thus, you can see at the bottom, there's a trust measurement gap, where we really need a measure of trust that is objective, in situ, continuous, and diagnostic of performance. Specifically, we are closing this measurement gap with a novel measure of trust. We call it the Continuous Online Numerical Score, or CONES. It is a 5-point rating scale designed to be directly incorporated in the environment and is continuous by prompting operators to enter trust values at predetermined intervals throughout a mission. Most importantly, CONES is unobtrusive with minimal disruptions to the primary experiment. And in terms of expectations for this measure we developed, we really wanted a lightweight alternative to standard trust measures and an alignment with behavioral measures for convergent validity, as well as using CONES to validate future real-time trust measures. You can see on the graphic the real-time measure of trust, with trust indicated here as trust of 1. Overall, our thesis at the bottom is that objective indicators of trust will correspond with trust ratings using CONES. And now, Beth will present our current study.
Unfortunately, I haven't mastered the Italian hand gestures. I'm lacking that. Thank you, Sandro. So to explore this thesis, we chose to assess the utility of the CONES measure in the context of an urban search and rescue, or SAR, mission. For this study, 31 participants were recruited, and they were instructed to imagine that an EF4 tornado had gone through downtown Houston, Texas. For this task, they used a number of quadrotor drones to navigate the area indicated in the darkened sections on the map, searching for survivors, and then delivering the necessary supplies. The blue, yellow, and green areas shown at the bottom indicated resource hubs for water, food, and medical supplies, respectively. Drones could only carry one supply kit at a time, but there were no restrictions as to what types of supplies any given drone could carry. Half the trials were completed while working under a low workload condition, operating 4 drones and using them to search an area of 1.9 square miles, whereas in the high workload condition, they used 8 drones to search an area of 3.6 square miles. The other factor in this study, the recommendation quality, was manipulated by controlling the order in which participants saw good and poor recommendations. So for example, good recommendations suggested paths into areas the participant had not yet searched, or routes between hubs and survivors, while poor recommendations directed them through the no-fly zones represented on the map as the areas with the red border, or leaving the operational area, or delivering the wrong type of supplies to a survivor. Unlike the workload conditions, participants were not informed about any differences in recommendation quality, and a new set of recommendations were presented roughly every 60 seconds during the mission. Participants were also instructed not to fly through the no-fly zones or to leave the designated area. So what's running now is a brief demo of the task itself. To conduct the SAR mission, drones had to be assigned individual flight paths, and they were capable of identifying any survivors located within 100 meters of that path. 20 survivors were included in each mission, and 5% of these were randomly selected to be in critical need, meaning that if within 2 minutes of being found, if they had not yet received their supplies, they would die. Once a survivor was found, the color of the marker used to indicate their location on the map specified the types of supplies they needed. So blue marker meant they needed supplies from the blue hub. And so in this example, a participant is completing the task under the high workload condition, operating 8 drones, and while receiving poor quality recommendations. Oh, that was the wrong thing. Sorry.
Alt tab.
Mhm.
Alt tab. There we go.
Thank you. Sorry about that. So throughout each mission, the cone's trust rating remains visible in the lower left-hand corner of the screen and allowing participants to respond at any time, but there were visual prompts presented every 45 seconds, and they did flash to indicate the need to respond until a response was entered. Here you can see an overview of the entire experimental session, which lasted approximately 2 hours. After confirming verbal consent and then completing the demographic and individual difference surveys, participants watched a brief tutorial demonstrating the task and the interface. This was followed by 2 hands-on practice sessions, each lasting 6 minutes and allowing participants to complete both the high and low workload conditions. During the primary phase, participants completed 4 missions, each lasting 12 minutes. The missions were created as a combination of the 2 factors, workload and recommendation quality. Each 12-minute trial was divided into 4 blocks of 3 minutes, with the quality of the recommendations presented alternating between good and poor. Mission order was counterbalanced, and participants were given a 5-minute break after the second session. Following each mission, participants were asked to rate their exertion level and trust in the system, and then after the final mission, they were asked to respond to a top 3, bottom 3 questionnaire to capture their best and worst parts of their experience. Participants used the keyboard to respond, T to increase their trust rating, B for decreased trust, and G to hold. Ratings were made on a 5-point scale ranging from 1, lack of trust, to 5, total trust in the system. And at the start of each mission, this was reset to 3, representing the baseline. Participants' behaviors in response to the recommendations also provided an objective indicator of their trust, particularly in whether they chose to review the review the recommendations before accepting or rejecting them. An interpretation provided by Lee and Murray suggested that the greatest trust would be evident through compliance, accepting recommendations without first reviewing them. The decision to read recommendations, though, before accepting or rejecting them, demonstrated imperfect trust in the system or verification. And finally, low trust or rejection would be demonstrated by rejecting the recommendations without reading them. The 3 trait scales were included to determine whether there were any individual differences related to the cone's trust rating. For the actual SAR task, performance was measured as the number of survivors who either were found, received the necessary supplies, or who died. Instances of crossing the no-fly zones or exiting the target area were reviewed, but were not sufficient to justify any statistical analyses. Finally, the post-mission measures were administered 4 times and included the NASA TLX to rate their exertion, as well as Schaefer's Trust Perception Scale to indicate how often they expected the system to demonstrate specific behaviors, such as consistency and predictability. Our analyzed sample included 28 participants who averaged 37 years of age. Of these, nearly half had some formal experience in aviation, and 40% reported military service. In their subjective responses, participants indicated a very low level of trust, averaging 2.5 over the entire study. Our analyses found no significant effects of manipulation or quality of the flight recommendations, and no consistent correlations with our subscales. Analysis of the objective behaviors confirmed that nearly 82% of responses were made after verification, followed by rejection and compliance. Most relevant to the study's thesis, though, was determining whether the cone's trust rating correlated with objective trust behaviors. This was assessed by linking each recommendation response to the participant's most recent previous trust rating. The figure shown on the left here summarizes the distribution of trust ratings by the 3 behavior types. Results of the chi-square analysis confirm a significant relationship, demonstrating that compliance increased in conjunction with cone's trust ratings with a medium effect size. This is especially relevant given the criticality of properly calibrated trust in battlefield operations. Finally, we found that participants performed well on the SAR task, finding 87% of tornado survivors and delivering supplies to 71%. As hypothesized, though, more survivors were found in the high workload conditions than low. There were, however, no differences between the number of survivors who received supplies and those who died. So with that, I will turn it back over to Sandro to discuss the summary of our results.
Thank you, Beth. So I cannot talk without moving my hands, so you'll see a lot of gesticulation here. Let's look at some of the advantages and lessons learned. So overall, we demonstrated the utility of cones during an operational task, and we can use cones to reliably capture operator trust throughout a mission. So we're very excited about this finding. We also have shown that trust ratings do correspond with greater compliance and decreased rejections, a key finding consistent with our thesis, which leads to a strong potential for capturing real-time trust attitudes in human-machine teamings, thus predicting trust behaviors. Some of the lessons learned that we show on the top right is we really need to vary the number and frequency of cones responses based on the task at hand. And we also need to maximize operator compliance to enter trust values. Also, we did not find significant correlations between cones and any of the trust surveys and individual differences. So we would like to capture alternative methods to indeed find some significant correlations there. Finally, trust rating with cones may still incur some mental burden, so we are exploring the possible advantages of using a binary trust, no trust response for some use cases. When looking at our manipulations, we found that workload had an impact on performance, but did not have an impact on trust, which is an important finding, suggesting that the relationship between trust and performance must be mediated by additional factors. Potential explanations is that task difficulty was insufficient to task cognitive resources, and additionally, we did not implement any consequences for accepting poor recommendations. Quick 2 charts, I promise. Moving forward, We have outlined an approach for accelerating the speed of science with proper design requirements for HMT technologies. We've shown that cones can be incorporated into operational environment, but we want to improve its procedure to investigate those correlation with truss performance and individual traits that I mentioned earlier. But important to us, we want to use cones as data labels to train machine learning models for real-time truss classification and applying them to modify in real time these adaptive human-machine interfaces like the example you see there on the right. And finally, in this last slide, we really want a call to maximize synergies between applied and advanced research. So as a community of researchers, engineers, and warfighters, we're all sharing the same goals, and we should strive to accelerate the validation of HMT technologies. You can see in a graphic right here a viable approach using a modeling and simulation environment with constructive forces, high-fidelity weapons and sensors, but most importantly, we need to use human-in-the-loop platforms so that we can measure humans in the environment and see what works and what doesn't work. Tying it back to our goal of evaluating trust calibration, with this kind of environment, that would enable us, it would facilitate the rapid testing of HMT hypotheses, which is really key here. And then that would then drive the design of adaptive interfaces and requirements for them. As a parting thought, we strongly believe that together we can accelerate the validation of HMT technologies and provide our warfighters with the best tools to achieve future mission success. Thank you.
Are there any questions?
So since the whole point of HMT is kind of as a supplementation or an addition to the human fighter, this measure the trust, can cons also be used to measure the trust between two humans as opposed to just a human to AI system?
Yep. Yeah, I would say there's certainly no reason it couldn't be if you're thinking about, I guess, like operating in the same room or in different locations.
Yeah, so just in general, so
Yeah.
basically if you're in the same test and instead of people manipulating drones and manipulating people, would there be a one-to-one comparison of cons of the HMT versus a human?
Yeah, I believe it's such a simple task that I think it would certainly be useful in either application.
I think it's a great question, right? Because when we look at human-machine teams, we start with the concept of us understanding really well as scientists how human-human teams operate, and then we apply those principles to human-machine teams.
So the T and B bodies, they're interactive or just indicated of the model class of that I could not figure out.
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
The T and B button,
Uh-huh.
so have they been interacting or did they just provide an indication whether the user wants more class of it?
So it was presented as a scale, almost kind of like an analog dial, and if they hit T, then it would just kind of roll up, and then if it was B, then it would roll down.
Great. We're at time. If there are additional questions, please join our speakers outside the room or later during the conference. Again, open your Itsec app on your mobile device, find the session in the upper right, click the thumbs up to rate the session and provide feedback. And if you're interested in being a presenter next year, please visit itsec.org for the timeline and process to submit an abstract. With that, again, thanks, Beth and Sandra, much appreciated. If you are staying for the next presentation, they'll be back in to scan your badges.